now. So we have some excellent presentations, really, really important presentations on young people's mental health. And in your literature about the webinar, you'll have some information about what futureMINDS is all about. And it's about promoting young people's mental health research for young people, with young people, involving young people, finding out what young people want in terms of mental health research here. So today's program, all of our programs are going to involve young people, and today's program is no different. We're going to start off today with Dr. Lisa Bunting. Lisa led one of the most important studies of young people's mental health in Northern Ireland. It was published on the 19th of October there, and it is the youth wellbeing prevalence study. So Lisa's going to be telling us about the results from that study, and that's bang up to date. There's so many lessons that we can learn in that and from that. So Lisa's starting us off today, and then we have some of our colleagues from Pure Mental, Matthew, Rachel and Owen, who are going to be talking about their work at promoting mental health and well-being in schools. So they're interested in shifting things for young people and improving mental health promotion work in schools. And indeed, that's so relevant to my role as mental health champion, because that's one of the things I'm working on with the Department for Education, is the mental health in schools framework. So again, a really, really important piece of work by young people. After our break, we have a short 10-minute comfort break, and then we have Helen Coburn from Youth Action Northern Ireland. We'll be talking about youth work and mental health and the role of youth work there. And then finally, we'll have Dr. Elaine Murray and Dr. Margaret McLafferty from Ulster. They'll be talking about the Student Psychological Intervention Trial, which is a survey of college students and an intervention to test an online treatment. And there's some really, really interesting work they're doing on DNA samples and saliva samples. So hopefully we'll hear a bit about that too. And then we have a 25-minute discussion where you can ask questions. So all throughout, you should be thinking about the questions that you want to ask our presenters and put them in the chat, any ideas, any comments that you have, and we'll try and use the chat then to stimulate the discussion as we move towards the end of today. So I'm coming here today from McGee, so I'm going to put myself on mute and my wee camera off for the duration of the different presentations, but I'll be coming in to try and keep everybody on track if need be too. So we will not faff about any further. We will get straight to our first presenter, Lisa. So hi, Lisa. Could you? Hello, we're delighted to have you here. This is great, and I'm looking forward to meeting you.
Thank you.
Talk about
Thank you for the invite. You'll be sick listening to this. This will be the third time you've heard this.
It's really important. I get different things out of it each time. To be honest, like, you know, there's just so much in this. It's huge. It's brilliant. It's so exciting. So do you want to share your screen there and let's get us started? And I'll mute myself because there's a few people in the back.
I will indeed. Is that up okay for everybody?
Yeah, we can see it really well. It's lovely.
Okay, I've got you along the side. I've managed to hide my own view because there's nothing more disconcerting than presenting and then watching yourself speak in a small box in the corner.
Couldn't agree more. Yeah, I've been doing a lot of that. You really start.
I know, it's really off-putting, and it also makes you think, oh, my haircut, I need to do this. Oh, the roots. But yeah. Okay. Good morning, good afternoon. We're actually good noon time is pretty much where we are, everyone. It's lovely to be here. And as Siobhan said, I'm going to be presenting on a study that was a collaboration with colleagues at Queen's University and University of Ulster, together with the Mental Health Foundation, which we launched in mid-October, so not that long ago. And it's the first ever study of the prevalence of mental health of children and young people aged 2 to 19 in Northern Ireland. I mean, there's been lots of other studies in the UK and in the Republic, and we've based a lot of our work around, you know, extrapolating what we thought the rates were in Northern Ireland compared with that. But this first time we've had a study of our own, and this was funded by the Department of Health and the Health and Social Care Board. There's a lot to get through, so I'm probably going to try and move at a clip, but a reasonable pace. Last time, I learn every time I do this. Last time I rushed so much, my throat was so dry by the end of it, I thought I was going to have an asthma attack. So I'm going to try and tread a midline today, say a bit about the aims and methodologies, spend a fair bit of focus around some of the key emotional behavioural problems, mood and anxiety disorders, behavioural disorders, stress-related disorders, self-injury, self-harm, and suicide attempts. What I'm going to do is say a little bit about the measures that we've used for those, what the context is in terms of what we know from the UK, Ireland, or international research, just to set those kind of those important findings in their context. And I'm going to say a little bit, but not go into as much detail, about various other risk categories that we looked at within the research: autism, psychotic-like experiences, eating disorders, and problematic social media use. And also do a bit on adverse childhood experiences and some of the initial analysis that we have done around identifying predictors for children's mental health, and finish up with some of the key messages. Okay, in terms of the survey methodology, this was a random probability household survey, and it was conducted, all the feed work was conducted by Perceptive Insight, which is an independent research company that we commissioned to help us with the research. And it was done between June 2019 and March 2020. And you'll see that the kicker there is March 2020. We finished field work a week before we went into national lockdown. So the survey gods were smiling upon us. And this is, in a sense, unbiased data that reflects the mental health needs and issues of young people prior to COVID and lockdown, though as I'm sure we can imagine, that has done nothing necessarily to help those situations. So the sample was drawn from the postcode register of all households in Northern Ireland, the Pointer database. It was stratified by county and deprivation decile. And where there were households with one or more children or young people in the age group we were looking for, 2 to 19, the child with the next birthday was the one that was the designated participant. So in total, of the many households that we were in contact with, we had 3,074 children and young people who completed the survey in relation to their mental health needs. And all parents also, 2,800 parents also completed the parent component, which did look at their own mental health using the general health questionnaire. So overall, we had a very healthy response rate of 67%, which we were extremely pleased about. And in terms of the survey itself, generally it lasted anywhere between 30 to 45 minutes. And there was various different forms of completion depending on the age of the young parent. So for the age group 2 to 10, parents completed their own part of the survey, and they also completed the children's mental health component on behalf of their child. For the 11 to 15-year-olds, the parents completed their own survey, and the young people completed the mental health component of themselves. And the same for the 16 to 19-year-olds. We were very keen to get as many parents as possible, but where parents were unavailable or didn't want to take part in their element of the survey, or the young people lived independently, the young person completed some additional questions on their family background. Obviously, given the nature of a lot of the questions, they're very sensitive. We use computer-assisted self-completion for most of those questions, and we use standardized measures throughout. And I'll say a little bit about that as those measures as we go along. So starting off with the first of our areas, this is emotional and behavioural problems. It's not necessarily those groups that are at a clinical level, but significant enough. It will include some children with clinical level problems, but it's still that group who are suffering quite a lot of distress or problems in these areas. And for that, we use the Strengths and Difficulties questionnaire, which is a very widely used international measure. It's been used in any number of surveys within the UK and Ireland. And it identifies children and young people at risk of emotional and behavioural difficulties. What we know from a number of recent English surveys with 10 to 15-year-olds, that roughly speaking, somewhere between 10 to 16% of young people in that age group have been identified at risk of emotional problems using the SDQ girls tend to have higher rates than boys. And we've seen in the UK and the international literature that in some surveys, those rates seem to be increasing over time. We often see greater variation in the rates of behavioural problems. These can go anywhere from 8 to 19% for conduct problems and 15 to 26% for hyperactivity. And again, boys tend to have typically much higher rates than girls. The SDQ also measures problems that young people have with their relationships with their peers. And it also looks at problems with pro-social behaviour, for example, being considerate, being kind, being helpful to others. And what we see from the English surveys, from the Understanding Society surveys, that again, a fairly significant minorities, 15 to 19% for peers and 12 to 15% for pro-social behaviour, problems in this area. What we found from our survey was that roughly speaking, 12% of young people were at risk of emotional problems, 10% conduct problems, 15% hyperactivity. And that's broadly in keeping with what we've seen from other UK and international surveys. So that's suggesting that Northern Ireland is roughly within that kind of range. What does stand out is that we see significantly smaller levels of problems with peer problems and pro-social behaviour. And that's a particularly interesting finding that we want to think about and explore a lot more about why that might be the case and what difference that makes perhaps in relation to some of our clinical disorders. We didn't find any overall gender differences in relation to emotional problems, but when we looked at the individual age groups, interestingly, we found that males aged 5 to 10 had higher levels than females in that age group, and they were really quite significantly high. And in keeping with the literature, the 16 to 19-year-olds had the highest levels and were significantly higher than males in the same age group. We also compared the rates, according to deprivation, and rates were higher in the most deprived quintile compared to the least across all those categories, with the exception of pro-social behaviour. So moving on to more kind of clinical diagnosis to look at common mood and anxiety disorders. In addition to what we looked at in the SDQ, we used the revised Children's Anxiety and Depression Scale, the RCADS. And this is a 47-item questionnaire. It can be completed by parents or self-completed. And it produces clinically relevant indicators based on diagnostic criteria for 6 common mood and anxiety disorders. And what we know broadly from UK research and the most recent Mental Health of Children and Young People survey in England is that around about 8% of 5 to 19-year-olds meet the criteria for a mood or anxiety disorder. Again, rates tend to be higher for girls than boys, and anxiety tends to be more common than mood disorders, and prevalence tends to increase as children get older. What we found in our results was that 12.6% of children and adolescents had a common mood or anxiety disorder. We didn't necessarily see any significant difference between girls and boys. I mean, a slight percentage increase for girls, 13 versus 12, but nothing statistically significant. In relation to the specific disorders, panic disorder was 6.8%, separation anxiety disorder 5.2%, depressive disorder 5%, social phobia 3.8%, OCD 3.1%, and generalized anxiety 2.7%. Interestingly, again, we see that boys 5 to 10 have significantly higher levels than girls in the same age group across all of those disorders. And that's quite unusual. It's not something we've seen elsewhere in the literature. It also fits very nicely with what we saw from the SDQ, reinforcing that there is something here. Again, that's something we want to look at a little bit more. Is this something that's coming down the line? Is this something that we're picking up because our survey is more recent, or is this something that's peculiar to Northern Ireland, and what are the implications for that in terms of practice and policy? Rates were pretty similar across deprivation quintiles, with the exception of panic disorder, though they did tend towards higher rates in the more deprived quintiles for each of the disorders, even though it wasn't statistically significant. So if we think about that comparatively, and bear in mind we are using different measures and a different methodology, but mood and anxiety disorders are fairly well defined, regardless of the measure used. So thinking about this in terms of the context, it certainly suggests somewhat elevated levels in Northern Ireland, not outrageously so, but it does also mirror what we see in the adult literature, and that sort of has drawn us to the conservative kind of conclusion that they're roughly 25% higher than we might see in other parts of the UK. In terms of behavioural disorders, in addition to SDQ, we also included what the opposition defiance subscale of the ATAC to give us some more information on the prevalence of oppositional defiant disorder and conduct disorder. I think these are two of those common behavioural disorders. Statistics for these really do vary. We see lifetime prevalence of ODD somewhere at 12.6% in American adolescent populations, with 6.8 maybe the criteria for conduct disorder. And that tends to be the case. ODD tends to be twice as common as conduct disorder. Again, in the UK, the mental health of children and young people survey found that roughly 5% of 5 to 19-year-olds currently had a behavioural disorder, with 3% having ODD and 1.7% having some form of conduct disorder. And again, unanimously across the literature, rates are typically higher for boys than girls. Found in our survey, and this was the ATAC, is a measure that looks at lifetime estimates, was for lifetime estimate of oppositional defiant disorder of 10% and 5.5% for conduct disorder. It's similar to what we see in the international literature. And again, that pattern of rates being significantly higher amongst boys than girls, 12% versus 7.3% for oppositional defiant disorder and 6.9% versus 4% for conduct disorder. Again, we didn't see a statistically significant difference according to area level deprivation, though there was a downward trend as deprivation decreased. It's probably worth noting that, there's different ways of looking at deprivation. This is an area level measure that we're looking at. It's the deprivation rank based on the super output area of the address. We did find a relationship more broadly with other financial measures, such as well-being and receipt of benefits. And it just may be that area level measure is not subtle enough to pick up differences between the different groups. So it's not to say that deprivation doesn't matter. It's just, I think part of it is that this area level measure doesn't pick it up the same way, but we're going to be doing more work exploring that as well when we get into different forms of data analysis. Another important part of the survey was measuring trauma and stress-related disorders. And what we did was, for the first time, we use a measure of PTSD and complex PTSD. Complex PTSD is a relatively new diagnosis, can be quite controversial. It shares a lot in common with PTSD, but it also involves a component of emotional problems with emotional regulation and relational difficulties that separates it from traditional PTSD. And what we used was the International Trauma Questionnaire, the ITQ, to measure both PTSD and complex PTSD. We know this is particularly important given our own context in Northern Ireland, and there's people on the call as well who've been involved in a lot of this research. We know that lifetime and 12-month prevalence of PTSD in adults in Northern Ireland is high. It's been estimated to be 8.8% and 5.1%. Traditionally, women tend to have higher rates compared to men. When we look at younger populations, not unexpectedly, we see much lower rates. For example, the mental health survey in England found a PTSD rate of 0.2% for 5 to 10-year-olds, 0.6 for 11 to 16-year-olds, and 1.3 for 7 to 19-year-olds. So the risk tends to increase as young people get older. There's limited research at this point in complex PTSD because it is so relatively new. But what we've seen from research in the Republic on the past month prevalence for adults has been higher rates of complex PTSD, 7.7% versus 5% for PTSD. Obviously, when you're looking at trauma, it needs to be viewed in conjunction with a screener to identify what is the nature of the trauma, because that's a prerequisite to having one of these disorders. So we use the International Trauma Questionnaire in conjunction with the Child and Adolescent Trauma Screen, which is a 14-item checklist, which is used to assess young people's exposure to various types of traumatic events. And for this particular part of the findings, this was only asked of the 11 to 19-year-olds within the sample. What we found was that the majority, 63.2%, did not report any trauma exposure, but 36.8% met the trauma exposure criteria for either PTSD or complex PTSD. And the most common traumas were witnessing violence, being involved in a serious accident, and the sudden death of a loved one. In terms of the disorders, the estimated prevalence in our findings of both combined was 4.9%. For PTSD, it was 1.5%, and for complex PTSD, it was 3.4%. The prevalence was higher for PTSD for males, which is interesting and something we don't see so much in the literature. And the prevalence of complex PTSD was higher for females. I think what we see there is a really interesting interaction between gender, the nature of the trauma that you've been exposed to, and how that evolves into different mental health pathways. And that's something that we want to look at again in terms of our further analysis, that relationship with trauma and trauma type and the interaction with gender. PTSD and complex PTSD, again, were not, as with other measures, were not significantly associated with area level deprivation. Another thing that we looked at was self-injury, suicide thoughts or attempts. And what we found was we used two questions taken from the Deliberate Self-Harm Inventory and the Suicide Behaviours Questionnaire revised. And sort of setting that within its context, we know, unfortunately, that these kind of issues are very common in UK and Irish youth. So lifetime prevalence for 16-year-olds in the UK, it's been 7% for suicide attempts, nearly 10% for suicidal thoughts, and nearly 12% for self-injury. And both suicidal thoughts and non-suicidal self-injury have been strongly associated with first-time suicide attempts when these young people have been followed up. We also have a number of studies that in Northern Ireland that Siobhan's been involved in, which identify concerning levels of suicide attempts, thoughts and behaviours amongst the university population, so young adults really. So 7.7% for suicide attempts, 31% for suicide ideation, and nearly 20% for self-injury. So there's an important and concerning context there. What we found in our study, try and go back here. Now, once I'm on this and I've done this, I don't know how to go back. Can anybody advise?
Back button. That's not very helpful, but just your back, you know, the back arrow.
Previous. Yeah, it's just sometimes it doesn't go on, it goes back. Right, I've got it. Oh, damn it. No.
Oh, yeah. No, you're doing grand. Take your time, and we have a bit of extra time for questions, so don't worry.
There we go. Okay. So looking at our results for self-harm, what we found was that 9.4% of 11 to 19-year-olds reported self-harm and behaviour, 12% reported thinking about or attempting suicide, and of those, half of those roughly had made a plan, and 3.5% had made an attempt. Significantly higher self-injury and suicide ideation were significantly higher amongst females than males. And rates were higher for the 16 to 19-year-old group than the 11 to 15-year-old group for both of those categories as well. And interestingly and worryingly, rates of self-injury amongst girls aged 16 to 19 years were much higher than findings from other international studies. So that again, that suggests that's an area that we want to look at further and think about in terms of policy and practice. And screening positive for self-injury or suicidal thoughts or attempts wasn't linked with deprivation. So very quickly, I'm just going to touch on some of the key findings in relation. We won't have time to go into these in any major depth. But we used a variety of screeners that we were interested in identifying young people at risk of particular area of disorders, not just to present prevalence statistics, but also to think about how the feasibility of some of these screeners and these measures for their use in practice populations and in clinical practice as well. So for autism, we identified 7.7% of children and young people at risk of autism, keeping with the literature, rates higher for boys than girls, no relationship though statistically with deprivation. And quite uniquely within a kind of community sample, large scale community sample of this age group, we also included a measure of psychotic-like experiences. And this could be people hearing voices, audio hallucinations, not feeling the constant feelings of deja vu, a whole series of questions aimed at getting at quite unusual experiences, which we're starting to understand are actually relatively common. What we found was that 19% of adolescents screened positive for this. And this is not to say that 90% of the young people are psychotic. But what we do know, increasingly people are identifying these at-risk mental states. So we know from research that people who screen positive on this, a significant minority over a period of time will go on to have a psychotic disorder. How we refine that and understand that still is a work in progress. But importantly as well, a lot of these screening positive, this is often comorbid with other mental health problems, particularly mood and anxiety disorders. So certainly that 19% aren't in psychosis right now. A small proportion will go on in the next few years to have a psychotic disorder, but a substantial number more than likely have also mood and anxiety disorders. And again, that's something we're going to be looking at. We also looked at eating disorders. We found that 1 in 6 young people had engaged in a pattern of disordered eating and associated behaviours. Concerningly, 7.3% had reported engaging in induced vomiting, which is significantly unhealthy and potentially dangerous behaviour already, regardless of whether they meet threshold. Rates were much higher, twice as high for girls and boys, 23% versus 10%, and there was no relationship with deprivation. We also looked at problematic social media use. Now, this is badged as a social media disorder, but realistically speaking, there is no social media disorder, but it is designed, the measure is designed, it's the language of the tool, it is designed around trying to get into some of those kind of addictive behaviors, withdrawal, getting angry if you can't get on social media, fighting with people because you spend too much time on social media, those kind of concepts. So using that measure, we found that 4.7% met the criteria for social media disorder. Rates were higher for females than males, and it's somewhat lower than estimates. This is a new measure, so the estimates are from a Dutch sample there. So, but there's still a significant minority there, and there was no relationship with deprivation. As part of the research, we also felt it was important to look at children's exposure to adverse childhood experiences, ACEs. Some of you may be very familiar with the term, because we know that this is consistently identified as having a very strong and graded association with physical and mental health problems in Northern Ireland. And we know from previous research that a significant proportion of adults, young adults, have high levels of ACEs within the population. So we use the traditional 10 ACE kind of measure that people may be familiar with, measures emotional abuse, various forms of maltreatment and various measures of family dysfunction, including alcohol abuse, parental mental health, etc. What we found was that more than half of young people aged 11 to 19 had 0 ACEs, but a third had 1, 8.6 had 2, and 5.7 had 3 or more, with parental separation and parental mental health problems being the most common ones. Females were significantly more likely than males to have exposure to 3 or more, and there was a strong relationship with deprivation as well. Part of the initial stages of our analysis, we did some multiple regression analysis using a range of different factors. I'm not going to go into the details of that, but we were trying to look at them at very different levels, individual child factors, age, gender, health, family factors like parental marital status, type of household, family functioning, which we use the ACEs as a measure of family functioning, parent mental health, and a range of socioeconomic and neighborhood factors, the area that they lived in, the impact of the troubles and paramilitaries. Individually, we find almost all of those had an association with common mood and anxiety disorders. But once we controlled for all of them together, there were 6 that emerged as being the most significant. And of those, it was the ACEs, the childhood adverse experiences, that was the heavy hitter. So it increased the ratio of any mood or anxiety disorder by a ratio of 8. Obviously, age is important. So, 16 to 19-year-olds are 5 times more likely to have a mood or anxiety disorder than the youngest age group. Child health and special educational needs, particularly in the area of emotional and behavioural problems and concentration, not surprisingly, have a strong association as well, as does the family being in receipt of social security benefits and parental mental health, where the relationship isn't as strong. Obviously, that's initial analysis, and we'll want to do an awful lot more, but those are the 6 factors that are emerging as the kind of target areas if we were thinking preventatively about mental health amongst children and young people, specifically in relation to mood disorders. Right, I'm conscious that I'm sorry, Siobhan, I've gone well over time, as I always do. I never get to break, I always think I've got it, and I never get to break it down into a manageable session. So I will finish very quickly just by saying these are some of the key messages for us at this point in time, that we've 1 in 8 young people who have a common mood and anxiety disorder. We conservatively estimate that this is roughly 25% higher than we see in England. There is something about that group there, those 5 to 10-year-old boys, and those emotional problems that seem to be particularly prominent for them. And again, these really high figures for our 16 to 19-year-old girls, and they're going to be transitioning potentially into adult services, going to university, leaving home. There's a lot happening in that time and that age group that we need to think about. And obviously, of course, those key risk factors that we have identified as well, and how they relate to common mood and anxiety disorders. PTSD, it's a substantial minority. I'm not even going to try and go back. And there is really interesting stuff about complex PTSD, how we understand it, and how gender and exposure, and I imagine particularly sexual abuse, interact with these particular disorders. There's fairly concerning statistics for young people in relation to eating behaviours and disorders. Again, young girls, really far and away the biggest group within this, and that's 1 in 14 of young people who are reporting engaging in making themselves sick in a way to try and control their weight. It is something that we need to be addressing very much at a cultural level. I just know this can't be addressed purely at a clinical level. And again, the same for the self-harm and suicidal thoughts. They are in keeping with what we see broadly in the literature. Those self-injury amongst 16 to 19-year-old girls was really high, comparatively so, and there really is something there about how we address that for that particular group of young people. Mental health problems were very common amongst parents. I haven't presented on the details there, and there was a strong link between parent mental health and the young person's mental health again. And really where this all takes us, that there's there's good things in that we don't have these really, really high figures. We were worried initially that might be the case. There's positive things for us in terms of, pro-social behavior and peer problems, which seem to be a lot less, but there's still those concerning findings and for particular groups. And it's very clear that, this is never going to be managed purely at the provision of clinical services. It is always going to be at this multi-level approach of how we work with families, because it is a family, it's a system. Mental health is experienced as a family system problem, not just as an individual problem. So it is about how we use those approaches in terms of families, schools, communities to harness different forms of support to try and meet the needs before they escalate to a clinical level. I'm going to finish there, Siobhan, and apologise, as I always do, for going so badly over.
No, don't apologise. That's been fantastic. Really, really useful. Lisa, thanks so much for that. I think you have a teaching commitment, which means you can't stay around for a panel discussion. So can I ask you a question now? Is that
yep,
right?
Go ahead.
I just don't want to miss you. And also we asked the same question of Kathy Creswell last week. I just think it's interesting to hear your views about the impact of the pandemic layered on top of what you now have learned about young people's mental health, and it's worrying that our needs are greater here again than other places. So what do we need to do now to come out of the pandemic? What is going to be the impact of the pandemic on top of this, do you think? And what should we be doing now in terms of policy and practice and research even?
I mean, you can imagine that the very nature of the pandemic and the way it operates, that mood and anxiety disorders, may have been exacerbated a lot. Anybody with an OCD or a predisposition. I mean, this is the nature of the general kind of low level anxiety that sort of exists. Anybody who maybe have social anxieties as well, going out, those kind of things. I mean, the very nature of what we've been asked to do in ways will have exacerbated an awful lot of that. On saying that, for some young people, the stress will have been school. They've been being bullied at school. For some young people, actually being at home hasn't been, has actually made it slightly better. I don't think that will be the overall message. Yeah. But I'm conscious. I've done work with Foster Network and looking at some of their surveys of their parents. It's often a tale of two cities. If you're fairly well off in terms of you're well positioned in terms of your house and your access to green spaces, and you can probably weather it okay. But if you've lost your job, or you and your partner have lost your job, and there's two of you, and you're in an apartment, and you have no garden, you're under stress. I mean, again, you can imagine those ACEs. Family situations that were maybe already tense have got a lot tenser. So there's a whole big maelstrom of factors there that I think very most likely will come out, that they have made people's mental health much, much more difficult, and maybe help to expose young people who maybe had a predisposition. I'm saying that, I think the opportunity is we're now thinking about it a damn sight more. Everybody understands that. He has been told to sit in their house and not go and meet anybody, and is wondering why they're irritable, ratty, feel like crap. At this point in time, I don't think we're going to hear the same kind of pushback of you just need to get on with it. I think there's actually an opportunity here. People really understand what poor mental health can feel like, and how important relationships are to it, and how important support is. So I think there's an opportunity there, as long as we can try and avoid getting driven down a medical research and service provision route for the next decade.
That's brilliant, Lisa. That's so fantastic. That's a big message I'm taking away. That's the thing you said. It's mental health is a family system problem, not just an individual problem. It's about the family and the community. Clinical services are important, but they're not the whole picture. And I think we're losing some of that in the drive towards more services, more treatments, more counselling for people, without recognising that it works, with those families.
I always remember a service manager when I worked in NSPCC. They worked with specialists there, sexual abuse therapy services, and she said, if you haven't got the family working with you, and you haven't got a way to help them address what happens, come on to me for 1 hour a week when they go back home, it becomes irrelevant. So it has to be that approach of how it's understood and dealt with at the family level when you're not in the clinical setting, because that will only be a very tiny, small period of time, assuming you get there to begin with.
Yeah, and let's face it, with waiting lists and everything as they are, you know, a lot of people
Yep.
aren't getting there quickly enough. But a lot of the demand I'm seeing as mental health champion is people coming in and saying, I want the counselling for my child. And they kind of don't maybe appreciate that broader context and the impact of the parents' well-being and the parents' mental health in the community on that child, and how
Totally.
just by shifting and changing all those things, you can make a big difference. Yeah. But
Or
that's
even just educating young people about their parents' mental health as well, or that people understanding, you know, especially if it's a long run problem. You know, taking a long time to get our heads around this in child protection. This may happen again. What are we going to do? Let's not end up with emergency protection orders. Let's have a plan.
Yeah.
Let's have signs. Let's have safety plan, and let's do this. And let's teach the young people to understand that actually, when mom or dad is like that, it's actually maybe outside of their control, and this is what we're going to do. So it's, you know, to try and minimize some of that negative impacts. I think it's in silence. That's where kind of, you know, negative thinking, misunderstanding, stress, feeling like that's where all those kind of things take root. And if we have a, you know, a more open discussion within families, then maybe people know how to seek support a lot better.
Yeah. Brilliant. Look, I'm really sorry, but we do need to move on to our next
I
presenter.
know, and I apologize again, Siobhan. I always do.
We'll get you again. Don't
One
worry.
day I will have this down to a 20-minute presentation.
No, you're fantastic. That was great. Great. I mean, it's a huge study. You could talk for hours about it, yeah. And look forward to seeing all the papers coming out as well and sharing those and
No,
helping. You know, I know there's more analysis.
no pressure.
No pressure, but so much we want to know about areas and different risk factors and how everything interacts. So everybody's just so excited about this research. So thank you so much for leading it, and for everything it's going to
No
contribute.
problem. Thank you. I'm going to leave you.
Okay, bye bye.
Take care. Bye.
I'm going to introduce our next speakers, very patiently waiting. I think we have Matthew, Rachel, and Owen from Pure Mental. So just take your usual time there. Don't feel that you have to reduce your presentation, because we have extra time at the end that we could clip from the discussion. So do we have you there? Do you want to say hello?
Yep, I'm here.
Oh, there's somebody here.
Hello, this is Owen.
Hi. Do you want to share your screen?
Yeah, I'll just get a PowerPoint up.
Okay.
Is Matthew about here as well?
We have.
I am indeed Owen. Yep, super.
Excellent. It's lovely when it works. I'm so impressed by Pure Mental. Everything that they do is brilliant, and we have so much.
Can everyone see that?
Yeah.
Yep.
This is great.
Yeah.
Okay.
There you go.
Okay. So let's get started. I'll mute myself there and off you.
Hello everyone. Thank you very much for having us on. We really appreciate the opportunity to present to you all. And I'm sort of here to give a bit of background about Pure Mental with Owen and Rachel. My name is Matthew. I'm one of the two co-founders for Pure Mental, and I'll let the other two introduce themselves.
Hi, I'm Owen. I think my official title is Senior Coordinator, and I've basically been with Pure Mental since day one, basically, because Matthew and Jay were my friends in high school, so I just decided to hop on board and help them out.
And I'm Rachel. I'm also a Senior Coordinator. I sit on the board of directors with Owen and then Matthew and Jay. And I joined Pure Mental in January, so it's almost a year now, at their first rally. That's where I met them.
So I'm not sure how much you know about Pure Mental for everyone on the call, but we are the first entirely youth-led mental health campaign and lobby group in Northern Ireland, and we were started obviously back in August of last year with myself and Jay when we were 17, with the aim of improving mental health awareness and education within all the schools in Northern Ireland, and obviously have a very strong focus on youth involvement and youth engagement, that sort of thing. So that's obviously very important to us to have the voices of young people heard.
Yeah, I was born out of the lack of education and openness about mental health that Matthew and Jay had experienced during their years in school, and the frightening high rates of suicide and poor mental health of young people in Northern Ireland. As we all know, they're beyond
Yeah,
anywhere else in the UK.
Yeah, for us it seemed that very little was being done, so we decided to do something. Our team has now grown from just 2 founders to a team of 5 leading our projects, and we have a 6th person on research. Our team has changed, but our goals and commitments have not. Tackling stigma and bettering mental health and education will always be our top priority here at Pure Mental.
So to give you a bit of a brief outline of what we've been doing the past year, what we're doing at the minute, and what we're looking to do in the future. As I said before, we started in August of last year. Oh, oops. And at our very first meeting, we sort of had a look of a plan of what we wanted to achieve, what we wanted it to look like, and we started contacting schools. We set up our own sort of unofficial school committee in our school, which I'm not getting into that, but obviously more schools followed after that. I think we're up to, I don't know the exact number, but it's about 15 roughly schools from across Northern Ireland involved at the minute, which we're looking to grow as much as we can, obviously.
Yeah, we started 2020 with a rally at Cornmarket in Belfast, and that really got us a lot of support and spread a lot of awareness for our campaign. It's really what started our current trajectory. This year we've also continued to grow the number of committees we have within schools, and sorry, I'm in schools and bells going. During lockdown, we began a lighthearted podcast on issues suggested by our followers to help entertain them and us whilst we all sit at home. The podcast has grown and expanded ever since.
Yeah, that's the Pure Mental podcast, so be sure to check that out. Most recently, we've begun working on our toolkit project, which we'll tell you about in a minute. As you can see, we've got quite a few exciting things planned for the future, but we want to focus on what we're doing right now.
So the focus of Pure Mental has always been to improve education and awareness of issues in schools specifically. That's always been our focus, because we know other groups are doing very good work in other areas, but we wanted some sort of youth campaign that was, spreading the voices of young people, that they could talk in their own language about mental health. And sort of up until now, our only way of doing that was through, as I said, small committees in individual schools, and lobbying policymakers and speaking to schools and teachers and pupils directly. So I want to tell you a bit about what we're going to do now.
This new project, our in-school toolkits, are our way of directly providing resources and actively supporting schools, rather than leaving the trouble of organizing and financial projects to individual schools, or relying upon the executive to deliver this service in these unstable, unpredictable, and all-consuming circumstances we find ourselves in.
The toolkits are designed to introduce key concepts of well-being and a healthy mindset, such as friendships, talking, bullying, stress, and just general negative emotions in an age-appropriate manner. Resources within the kits will be tailored to specific key stage groups. For example, we aim to include character-based activities, literature, colouring exercises, assemblies and posters, etc. for Key Stage 1. Key Stage 1 will also be our area of focus for the first set of kits, before we move on to Key Stage 2 in secondary schools. These toolkits will be a repeatable model for all schools, allowing for a consistent and comprehensive set of resources for all schools to use to introduce the key concept of mental health. Throughout the development of these toolkits, we will be seeking consultation with key stakeholders such as schools, other mental health organisations, young people, and the Northern Ireland Executive to ensure that all contents are relevant, suitable, and effective in their aims.
So to give you sort of a brief outline of what will be in the Key Stage 1 toolkits, we'll have obviously character-based literature. So all of it will be based around, if you can sort of think of like Mr. Men, that's sort of the idea for Key Stage 1, to sort of introduce mental health in a very age-appropriate way, where we can talk about, emotions, like being a good friend, being a good listener, that sort of thing. And these characters will obviously be in the form of short stories from local authors, with the aim of better understanding emotions, what they're all about. So that's certainly one of the big things in the toolkit.
Also included will be flyers on mental health in Northern Ireland, as well as a large banner for each school, and a series of eye-catching posters. There'll also be colouring booklets, similar to the character, the story booklets with the same characters, one per pupil with similar messages and the same, and as well as that we'll have calming yourself booklets.
Each toolkit will contain enough of these short calming booklets for each pupil in Key Stage 1. The booklets are to be used by pupils in times of stress and anxiety to help calm themselves, find reassurance, and to motivate them for the rest of their day or task. We're also including a glossary of feelings, and this resource is based on our expanded and adapted version of Professor Brené Brown's list of core emotions. For this glossary of feelings, we will have adapted Brown's list, adding and taking away some aspects to make it more relevant to the Key Stage 1 users of the kit. And rather than keeping it a list, we've incorporated child-friendly definitions of these core emotions to give young people a better understanding of what they mean. This glossary is to be used to help young people articulate their thoughts, feelings, and emotions better by demonstrating that emotions go far beyond just happy, sad, and angry. In total, we aim to include and define 32 words in this glossary. Finally, in-school committees are something we've been championing for over a year now, and we want to help as many teachers as possible establish them, which is why we're also including guidance on establishing in-school committees.
Obviously, I've talked quite a bit about school committees in the past. If you've been on if you're on my all-party group to the mental health one in July, but really committees have been our flagship project for since we started. We've got a growing fleet of committees across schools in Northern Ireland, and as you can see, there is one of our committees that was taken yesterday. They were putting up mental health boards and that sort of thing in their school, which is obviously really, really good to see. And obviously committees are run at no cost to the school. And obviously we'll talk a bit about issues later on, but this is of no cost to the school. We're looking to get resources for the school to support committees in their role instead of sort of having it them to do most of the work. But they're all youth led. They all make their own decisions. They do research for schools. They do fundraising. They do, they organize speakers and assemblies in their school. So we think it's a really important project of ours.
Yeah, Pure Mental committees put young people at the forefront of the discussion on mental health to build lines of communication between young people, their peers, their schools, and the decision makers, and assist schools through any available training, support, and resources available at no cost to the schools themselves, which is really important to us. We are also really excited about our current committees and are excited to launch new primary school versions of them in next year.
Very happy to provide any of you who want it an overview document on our committees to give you more information on their purpose, structure, funding, and leadership.
Now, obviously being entirely youth led by 4 or 5 young people between the age of 17 and 19, we're obviously all in school or uni. So it's obviously being youth led is very much a double-edged sword, so to speak, whereas we find that it's the biggest positive is that we can represent the views of young people. We can get young people's opinions. We can get them involved. But it's also our biggest negative because sometimes we're not taken quite as seriously as we would like to be, and obviously being constant participants is obviously difficult with other commitments in uni and school. In terms of structure, we're in the process. We started that last week of registering as a charity. Hopefully that'll be done by the sort of the first couple of months of 2021, which obviously brings a lot more structure to what Pure Mental is going to do. But with funding, we obviously want to stay independent, and all of that is coming out of our own pockets until very recently. So it's very hard to fund our own project, and especially with this big project of toolkits, that's going to cost a huge amount of money when you look at it from our perspective of being students. And perhaps probably the biggest issue for us is connections with obviously connections in schools. Currently the young people themselves have to first message us and then say that they want to set up a committee in their school. It would be it would be invaluable to us to have connections with teachers and principals in schools so that we can get feedback on how we can improve committees, and so we can get more committees set up across all regions of Northern Ireland. And obviously connections in business, that sort of thing would be very useful for funding as well. But you know, we've only been at it for a year, so I think we'll just keep improving for the long term. I think that's everything I want to say on obstacles. So thank you very much for listening to us. We hope you enjoyed our presentation. And you know, I don't really know what's going to happen with the questions. I don't know if that's later on or now, but obviously we're happy to answer anything and provide you with any more information that you want about anything. Thank you very much.
Yep, thanks for listening.
Thank you for everything that you're doing. It's just so fantastic, because one of the things we've recognized as academics is that young people aren't part of the conversations, and we need to be talking to young people about what they want. So I know you feel like that your youth is a disadvantage. We're really grateful for everything you're doing. You're doing a lot of work for us. It's just amazing that we have groups like this of young people in Northern Ireland. So thank you. You're an inspiration. It's hard to talk about this stuff, and I certainly think about what I was like at your age, and there's no way I would have been able to do what you're doing. So that's just brilliant. You're a brilliant example to other young people. What we're going to do now is have a little break, and if we could come back in about 10 minutes, we could take our other, if you can stay with us until the end, we'd really like to have your voice as part of that panel discussion at the end, so we can talk about what young people would like to see and what the future would look like. So if that's all right, we'd like to keep you on board. I know you're at school and you've got all sorts of other things, so if any of you can stay, that would be great. And we'll now take a wee 10-minute break just for everybody else and come back at around 7-10 minutes past 1. Thank you.
Welcome back, Siobhan. Are you ready?
Sorry, I just had to wait until the alarm went off there. I'm here now. I was just digging there for a minute, so I couldn't come on. Thanks everybody for joining us again. Let me introduce our next presenter. This is Helen Coburn from Youth Action Northern Ireland. And again, this is a really, really important presentation about the Life Maps approach to building mental health in young people. So this is the youth work perspective and the methods that youth work uses. And it's, for me as a psychologist, it's a different approach, but it really, really works. It's not different, but it comes at it from a different angle. So if Helen's there, we
Yeah,
can get you started. Hello,
Yeah.
thank you so much for
Hello.
joining us, Helen. So yeah, off you go. And I think we have 15 or 20 minutes for the presentation. Thank you.
That's perfect. I do a wee presentation, and I decided to go a wee bit of a festive theme today.
Excellent.
To bring a bit of seasonal joy to our day. Yeah, so I work with Action, and it's a good presentation, and with limited time there's so much I could chat to. So I have the link to the website. A lot of the resources are available online, so I said I'm lightly touching on a few wee pieces. I'm just going to share a screen here. Okay, told you it'd be festive. Can you all see that okay? Someone talk to me.
I can see a grand. I was taking a wee screenshot, Helen, for Twitter because I just love your bubbles. They're fabulous.
Oh, here. No problems. There's more to come. More to come. Yeah, it was. So yeah, so I work for Youth Action, and I get to work in all different parts of the teams, but it's just about a creative approach to youth work in any group working settings that I'm doing, but also I'm involved in Youth Arts team, and we link in with the Rainbow Factory. So today I'm talking about Life Maps resource, which is incorporated in all of Youth Action's work. It came about a couple of years ago, sort of 2015, with research with psychologist Simon Ward and Liz McCardle, who now works for the university. And it really, there's a resource that has all the theory and stuff behind it, but there's also practical elements that can be incorporated in all styles of youth work. And it starts with the worker as well. So I will touch upon that, but it's a positive psychology model. And also, just checking this is coming up. My second. Not too fast. That's Virtual Rainbow Factory. So basically Life Maps has been part of Youth Action's work even before this year. But I'm going to bring it into a context of today, which is that Life Maps is still incorporated in our work we're doing, even though it's been a funny year, and also that Rainbow Factory's become virtual, and that's a fantastic resource reaching young people all over the place. Then we have PALS, which is being a friend resource. It's a bit of a buddy system, sort of training for young people and how they can support each other and get conversations about mental health. And then recently, a couple of weeks ago, that the Youth Empowered Digital Hub became available online, and that is another fantastic resource for young people to do with life skills, life skills, work skills, and for business and being self-employed. So there's a lot going on, and so I'm just going to touch lightly on things. And the other, basically, if anyone doesn't know about Youth Action, it's a regional charity working with young people all over for the last 75 years, mostly between 10 and 25 years of age. And it's really about supporting all young people to be healthy, happy, and hopeful. So I'm going to crack on just saying, I know we've had a lot of brilliant statistics today, and we keep up to date with what statistics are going on, and that impacts in how we work with young people, but also from our work, we are obviously feeding back with governance groups and training with youth workers. But similar to what's already come up today, this is where we're at, and this was happening even before sort of Corona. But the idea that young people are feeling unable to cope, the feelings of stress, social pressures, and then also about traditional gender messages and expectations, and then obviously uncertainty and change due to COVID-19. I'm not going too heavy with quantitative stuff today, because I know there's a lot of research
that's being shared. So I'm just a bit of sort of qualitative with young people I've been working with right now. So this is some of the topics that come up, and I have 3 quotes coming up now that I try to focus on being festive, but also these are quotes that I've had either recorded or face-to-face or in writing over the last week. So I've kept it very, very relevant to where we are right now. And the first one is a young person who is older, sort of 18, and saying that it's hard to get access online right now, but does appreciate that there's resources she can avail of free with herself, but talking about the school is a major worry and objective grades. And that's already come up already today, but that, you know, it's there and that's come up in conversation. The next quote I have is a young person who's in primary school, who's a bit upset because she was on her 3rd day of isolation because someone in her class had tested positive. So, you know, just feeling lonely only 3 days in, and that, you know, a young voice, you know, being shared, just not struggling right now. And then the last one I'm going to share for a bit of current context is a quote from a person saying they lost their granda and it wasn't to COVID, but wasn't able to bury him for 2 weeks. And they talked about that having somewhere they can still talk to people, having that personal touch, and actually having a bit of feeling, a sense of security and routine of somewhere to be and still connecting, even though it's not the same. You know, Youth Action, we're offering, you know, still one-to-one support with young people. Then there's Zoom sessions, and then also there's been small group work, obviously fall in line with social distancing and current policy on that. But powerful stuff coming through, and there are a lot of young people who don't engage in Zoom, and that's phone calls and meetups and things, because it can create a lot of anxiety, a lot of stress for them. I've tried to use a lot of visuals today. The Life Maps model has a lot of cool illustrations in it, and this is one of them. And this just touches upon, like, as a worker or anybody who's working with young people, you know, what are we bringing to the table? And whether it's online, you know, is where the world we're in right now, or in a youth work setting of a centre or a community centre, or walking outside, it's what are we bringing to it? And you want to create a safe space, and there's always space in any session that we do to chat and have, so even if you're there for an OCN and it's training led, or there's activity that has to be done with external facilitator, there should be time and space and a lot of energy taken into creating that to talk about whatever's happening, and also offer the right kind of support and signposting. So even online, that's what we've been doing a lot of. And because I link, I've referenced in Virtual Rainbow Factory today, that's a lot of what I do. I Zoom quite a lot and use a lot of visuals, and how we can do that, how we can still have that build connection quite quickly when we're not just having a meeting in person for a cup of tea. So Life Maps, there is a lot to it, but it's a very simple premise. I mean, it's a resource that can be used practically. You know, it's for individuals, but also then bring into groups. So this is just on the fact of using it. As there's tangible ideas and exercises, and each of the letters unpack a certain element to do with mental health. And I'm aware that, you know, mental illness is different to mental health and well-being. So, you know, we're involved in partnerships with Mindwise and that kind of thing, which is engaging with young people who do have mental ill health, and I work with partnership with Action Mental Health on that too. But promoting and supporting mental health well-being all the time, that's where Life Maps comes in. And you need to have mental ill health to be thinking about your own mental health well-being. The 8 interconnecting ideas which support the idea of flourishing mental health is what I'm going to chat about next. And in the resource, there's more detail on that and what it means, and also practical elements that you can bring to, you know, families at home, youth work setting, you know, personal, whatever. And it's just, and that's all was also created from work that was happening on the ground. So there's a real, you know, ownership of this, that has been shaped and developed. So the letters there outline just what we're talking about when I'm saying about life maps. And some of these words you might already know, but just sort of breaking it down into sort of a tangible idea. And we're focusing on getting young people to think about motivation and what motivates them. If it's for flow, and I'll use a lot of that. And for anyone who doesn't know what a flow activity is, if you can all think for a second, if you ever engage in something and for those 5, 10, 20 minutes, you're not thinking about what you're having for dinner tonight, or that someone you haven't text back, whatever it is, something that really engages you. And it's often a short period of time, because yes, you can enjoy things for an hour, 2 hours, whether it's fitness or dance and stuff, but to really, really have a flow activity that works for you, and that should be flexible. A lot of dance and drama examples, doing jigsaws. It's a very personal thing, going for walks. So flow activity is really important, and that's a healthy habit. A is for emotions, tapping into what emotional intelligence is, and there's activities around that. M is for mindfulness, which as well is flexible. For some people, it was focusing on breathing, but also just taking your time and understanding yourself. A is for accomplishments, which I use quite a lot. For some young people that I meet, whether it's in off Zoom or in Zoom, to have your phone charged and to remember to have fed your dog for the day is a celebration sometimes. To remember to get logged in, to be somewhere at a time that you're hoping to be at, is an accomplishment. So celebrating the small wins is really important, as well as the big stuff you can achieve together. So shared goals and bigger life accomplishments that we can have. But I would use A quite a lot just in the conversation and the work that I'm doing. So just those small wins, and especially right now, when some days can be harder than most. Yeah, and then purpose and social connections come up, which is always important in all of our learning and what we can share in together. So I'm just whistle stop touring this, but I'm going to jump right in and give you a flow activity challenge for yourselves today. So you've got 1 minute for this challenge. There's 8 parts of life maps, and I'm hoping you can find 8 random things in this picture that maybe shouldn't be there. So they're not a happy Santa. And it is weird having this conversation and it's quiet, but I'm hoping just for a minute, just giving yourself your own flow activity and just focusing and looking at this picture. And I do have the answers. By doing something as simply for 1 minute, you're almost giving your mind a nap, and that's very important. It doesn't matter how old you are. Wondering if any of you would like the answers. I'm just going to show you the next wee slide there. Nearly a minute. Okay.
I'm telling anyway.
What?
I'm kind of stumped.
Well, have you been focusing really hard for the last minute?
I'm not sure.
You're looking for something that shouldn't be there. Hopefully I've pulled everyone into their computer screen a wee bit, getting our minds woken up, and you're noticing, yeah.
That's the only one I got. That's amazing. I'm going to take a wee.
Yeah, no, I have all these resources. It's like I would use things like this on a daily basis, but I find they work, and they work whether I'm training with adults or young people. So, just waking up our minds, focusing on just for that 1 minute. You weren't maybe thinking about lunch or something that might be worrying you. So yeah, I just wanted to show a practical element rather than just talking. I break up some more wee elements in the life maps. So there's lots to it, but it does look at the scale, and we talk about and language that we can put to talking about mental health and well-being, and working with young people that maybe languishing and encouraging to feel or to work towards flourishing. We know it's not as simple as just having someone just saying, oh, feel better or do that, you'll be grand. I mean, that everyone's starting from a different place. Everyone has a unique experience and how they're coping. but it's those building blocks, and also not being afraid to chat about it. So that scale is moving, and as I said, it's about just, it is a continuum in the sense of that just because you're flourishing doesn't mean you'll always be there, and also with language, and maybe you're feeling more moderate, and that's okay. And just so language and these little illustrations help quite a lot in the life maps model too. But flourishing is people who've built a positive mental health and feeling good and doing well, and then we building resilience and being realistic with that too. Yeah. So before going to the next slide, I am conscious I can only do so much time-wise. So that's sort of just what I'm throwing out is with life maps. But the next one I'm going to talk about is the PALS resource, which came about quite recently as well. And it's really encouraging people to be a friend to each other, to get those conversations started with each other, and being aware of services they can signpost to. That buddy system I was talking about. And then we sort of been, there's research and training then around that, so that young people then respond and go, well, hang on, this works, this doesn't work. And it's also available online. Let's start the first slide. I showed you the website, and I'm going to talk more about that at the end. So one of the examples just from the PALS resource that I wanted to just as an example is a scale like this. So just talking about scales and things there, that, you know, are they able to spot when a friend's having a problem, and, you know, are they confident to know what to do to support them, and really kind of getting that conversation going. So although we do this in small group work and in the events that I run, you know, really kind of making space for chat and feedback and having life maps part of everything activity we do, because and flow activities, dance and drama and stuff. But there's actually a resource really and training around this that we can offer, and just on that. But you don't need to be an expert to do life maps, nor this resource, and that's the whole point. It's very, very accessible, and was helped be created by young people so that it makes sense. And the next free resource, well, that I'm touching upon is Virtual Rainbow Factory. So Rainbow Factory has been going over 35 years, and that is sort of performing art school side of youth action that really brings the power of creativity and mental health that I care about. Creativity and mental health are very close to my heart, but that, you know, as young people are involved in programs, yes, develop them artistically, but it's also about personal development and social development. And one of I'm so proud to be a part of Virtual Rainbow Factory, because since sort of March time, we try to move things online, and we offer sort of 3 parts to it, and it really has helped connect young people across Northern Ireland. So one of the parts is, of course, you know, Zooming and live sessions. Some young people want to do that, whether that's dance, drama, governance scripts with myself, so that they're getting involved in training sort of with offstage skills and feeding into planning events and that kind of thing. Also, an example there on the left is a Zoom session with For Down Syndrome Trust in Northwest, and the idea of what we can do right now with Zoom, and by beaming in with tutors and stuff. Then so we're going into people's centres where they're meeting, and also you can kind of more one-to-one Zooms or calls, or conversations and research, which I was involved in with Rhonda. So that's an element of zooming in from home. And then online, Virtual Rainbow Factory has its own website off Youth Actions page, which has resources in all elements of what it does, which could be dance, drama, front of house, technical skills, music studio. And that means if a young person isn't confident going online to Zoom, or maybe feeling they want to be on camera or whatever, that they can access resources to follow along, or just individual things, as well as a space to have a bit of fun. Young people, it's free resource, but it's password protected, so that young people you know, have been able to upload how they're staying creative, or video dances they've done or whatever. So it's a real safe space even online, and I'm more than happy to elaborate on this after at any point if people want to get in touch. But it's amazing, and I really like, there's so much to it. There's actually a video on, even just a snapshot video on the action page, just to kind of visually show you what's happening. But it's a big piece of work, and it's really, really helping young people stay connected, and they're in charge of feeding back to what's working and not working. And the last visual, well, next visual that I have is the Youth Empowered Digital Hub. So also then a strand of the Youth Action website is the same idea, which is a website, but it's dedicated to free resources for young people and workers and everyone out there that here are resources you can get a hold of and use practically with your work or at home or in life skills, work skills. And also then under the resources section there is where you're going to find the life maps I've been talking about. There's a billion online resources involved in. You've got PALS and being a friend resource. So that's all accessible and free to get access to. And that, as I said, individually, in groups. We're a membership organisation and working in partnership with a lot of people, a lot of groups. And you know, that working in partnership really feeds into how we can respond and support best we can. So that's sort of me coming up to the end of my slides, and I couldn't resist. This is for Rhonda. That even for checking in, and it's harder not to in person, but I use a lot of scales, especially if people struggle non-verbally, a lot of mixed abilities, young people too. And like checking in how we are actually feeling ourselves. So I often start sessions off by people asking, you know, which picture you're relating to. And sometimes people want to elaborate more on how they're feeling, sometimes they don't. That's okay. But, you know, to show a willingness to engage about talking about mental health and checking in and how we can engage creatively, even online right now, is so important, and to rise to the challenges that we have in front of us. So I'm hoping you all know your reflection to yourselves where you might be feeling right now, and that's the end of my presentation.
That's just brilliant, Helen. I love it. I love it. I'm number 5, but I don't know why.
And you don't need to explain. It's just how that's what you're feeling. You don't need to. Sometimes it's just for you to know.
I'm alert. Yeah, okay. And you can gain more insight into how you're feeling by trying to understand why you've selected the one that you've selected. Maybe.
It's just a creative approach. Well, yeah. I mean, I don't want to overanalyze either, but it's often a good starting example. That people can, you know, it pulling people in and being able to go, right, okay, does a check-in. How can we use the Zoom in a visual way to just get conversations going? And for someone who doesn't really want to chat, they can type what number, they can hold up their hand. You know, it's just I think we just have to be brave and just how we can engage and not. And even though the systems are different right now, maybe not get as much face-to-face and we're limited, not to shy away about being experimental and creative in our approach.
Oh, I love it. Thank you. Okay, well, we'll move swiftly on to the next presentation, and Margaret's all set there to tell us about the student psychological intervention trial. So Margaret, I'll just let you batter on. Thank you so much for being here, and sorry you have to wait to the end today, but
not at all. Can I double check that you can actually see my slides, because I was talking on another one day and discovered that nobody could see it.
No, we can see your slide. You're up there. Yes.
That's brilliant. Okay, so thanks a million for having us. So both myself and Elaine Murray, who is the PI on the project, are going to do, I suppose, a whistle stop kind of quick presentation on just what we've been doing and what this is all about. So this is a Chitin funded project, and we started this project back in 2019, and it's so there's 2 phases to it. As Siobhan said, it's the Student Psychological Intervention Trial, aka the SPIT project, and that's because of the saliva samples that we've collected within it. So it's been conducted at Ulster University and in Letterkenny Institute of Technology. And really the primary goal is to determine whether a guided web-based intervention is effective in alleviating symptoms of mild to moderate levels of anxiety and or depression among university or 3rd level students. So the project was launched back in September 2019. And so this is the first phase of the study. And we were trying to recruit 1st year undergraduate students across the institution. These were all over 18. And we were aiming to get 2,000 students. We nearly reached that. And out of that, we have 1,829 fully completed surveys. Now, the survey is a really comprehensive survey that was developed by the World Mental Health College Student Initiative that we're collaborators with, going way back to Siobhan's early days on the World Mental Health surveys. So out of our participants, as I said, they're all over 18. 72% were female, 28% male, and the average age was 21. And we've applied weights to all our analysis to make sure that they are representative of the student population under study. So currently, we are running our year 2 follow-up survey, and we've over 900 surveys fully completed to date. Now, we will be closing that soon, and I'll talk very briefly about that later on if we've some time. But just go back to the phase 1. So I suppose very brief snapshot on what we've been finding to date. So on, similar to Lisa Bunting's presentation earlier, quite a lot of mental health problems in this population now. I mean, we'd always talked about, students getting mental health problems when they were at university, and that the university experience can be stressful. But what we were actually finding is that a lot of students were coming into university with a lot of mental health problems already there. For example, 5.7% screened positively for depression, over 11% alcohol disorder, and drug abuse or dependence. We also asked them about suicidal behaviour, and 28% said that they had serious thoughts about killing themselves. 14.3% had made a suicide plan, 13.4% had engaged in self-harm, and 7.7% had attempted suicide, and quite often it was more than one attempt. Now, we had built into our survey what we call a high risk alert. And out of the students that participated, 144 students triggered this high risk alert, and they were contacted by either student wellbeing at Ulster University or an accredited counsellor at LYIT. And I mean, it was good to be able to intervene early and provide the help and support that these students might need. We asked them as well about help seeking. And 23.1% had received counselling previously, more females than males, and 13.1% had taken medication for emotional problem. However, if you think back to those figures for the current mental health problems, only 5.4% of participants were actually currently receiving treatment. So I suppose we have been thinking, right, what can we do to address this issue? We had ran a similar survey back in 2015. And from that, we had applied to do this Chiton funded project. So this then leads us into phase 2 of the intervention, which is what I suppose the SPIT project is all about. It's about testing the efficiency of this CBT-based intervention. And this intervention was developed by our collaborators from VU Amsterdam, Pim Kuipers and Helene Riper in particular. So unfortunately, COVID came along and we're a little bit behind, so we had to reschedule a few things. So the pilot study, which had been planned for spring this year, is now ongoing, and we have our first participants just signed up and started to do this. And then we're planning then the full randomized control trial for February, March 2021. And within that, the students will be randomized to either treatment as usual, which is the control group, or treatment plus the web-based intervention. And we're aiming to have 100 students for the full randomized control trial. So what is this intervention? There's 7 online sessions, and they consist of text, exercises, audio-visual components. We actually were able to secure some additional funding to make some videos from Chiton again for this. And the sessions, they last between 45 minutes and an hour. And the big thing about this type of intervention is that we actually have trained guides who help out and interact with the students, participants. And this has been found to be quite effective. And the other kind of advantage of this is that the intervention is available 24/7. So the students can do it at a time and place that suits them. So when we're finished with all of this, we're then going to have a qualitative study. Aware, one of our colleagues is going to, our collaborators on the project will run a number of focus groups to determine how effective how effective people felt the intervention was, what they liked and what they disliked. And then we'll also assess the effectiveness of the intervention through a series of questionnaires, just to see have the rates or the symptoms of anxiety or depression decreased. I'm going to hand over now shortly to Elaine, but just very, very briefly, I know there's been a lot of interest in the COVID questions and how COVID has been impacting on students. So again, thanks to Kaiten and the R&D office, we managed to get some additional funding to include some COVID related questions within the survey. And I'm just going to give you a very, very brief snapshot of this, but if anybody wants to come back to us later on, they can. So we can ask a number of questions. So about, like, say, stress, what stress did it cause you and what areas? So the big one that came out for the students was the increased social isolation was a huge problem for them. Family finances, not so much. And in terms of worrying about being infected, they were much more worried about loved ones getting infected than they were worried about getting it themselves. We asked them as well, various things about, like what were the main things that, impacted on them. So you'll see from this that a lot felt anxious during lockdown and their sleeping patterns were disturbed, which again fits in with some of Lisa's findings from earlier. The motivation and enthusiasm was reduced, and like they did find studying online difficult. They were relatively satisfied with learning from home, mixed experiences on that, but overall they did feel that their learning experience had been impacted by working from home. And they were relatively happy with their course team and with how their family interacted with them. And so that is to say, just a very, very quick snapshot. And I'm going to hand over now to stop sharing and hand over to Elaine for the second part of the presentation.
Okay, thank you, Margaret. Can everybody see my screen okay?
Yeah, we can, Elaine, thank you.
Great. So thanks a lot, Margaret, and for setting it up and introducing the SPIT study, and thanks for the invitation to be able to talk to everyone today. So as Margaret mentioned briefly, our study is called the SPIT study. For the major reason why we called it the SPIT study, although it's also a nice acronym for what we're doing in our RCT. But the major reason that we called it the SPIT study is that we are collecting saliva samples as part of our study. So from all of these first year students that took part in this study and in our previous study, the Ulster University Student Wellbeing Study, we asked them at the same time that they were completing this comprehensive online mental health questionnaire to give us a saliva sample. And the reason that we are interested in having a saliva sample is to be able to try to understand a bit better some of the biological changes that might be happening with particular mental health symptoms and disorders. So we know that the etiology or the cause or sets of causes of mental health conditions is very complex, and that it's an interaction between lots of different factors, including biological, social, psychological, environmental factors. It's very complex, but we do know that biology plays a role, and that by studying the biology and studying maybe the biological changes that might occur with particular mental health conditions, that we can maybe get a bit of an insight into what's happening there and try to identify some new ways to think about mental health and new targeted interventions for mental health conditions. So what we know about biology is that we know that some people may have a genetic predisposition to mental health conditions. And we know that that can interact with adverse life experience, both early in life and also in response to other adverse events or traumatic experiences in adulthood. And all of these things can then lead to biological changes within the body that we know then ultimately will cause the behavioural change or the symptoms that we think of when we think about mental health conditions like depression and anxiety. And a lot of what we know about the biology has been focused on this genetic predisposition, but also on changes in neurotransmitters or the signaling molecules within the brain that we know are responsible for changes in things like mood and anxiety. And those neurotransmitters like serotonin and norepinephrine and dopamine are the targets of all major treatments for mental health conditions, like all psychiatric medications at the minute. But over the last probably 20 years or so, we've started to understand that these biological changes in mental health conditions are a lot more complex than that. There's a lot more to it than just changes in neurotransmitter systems within the brain. And there are other systems that are at play and that are interacting that we can potentially look at to further understand the biology and the biological underpinnings of things like depression and anxiety. So what we're doing with our saliva samples is what we call biomarker discovery. So we're taking these saliva samples. So obviously the major biological changes that are happening that may lead to changes in mood are happening within the brain, but we can't take samples of the brain. We can't look at the brain on a regular basis. So we have to find other ways of looking at biological processes. And the way to do that really is to look at other tissues or samples like blood, and in our case saliva, that can help give us a bit of an insight into what's happening within the body, and hopefully give us some insight into changes that may be happening in the brain as well. And since so in addition to neurotransmission, we now know that we can look at all of these different levels of analysis to try to get a better understanding of what's happening within mental health conditions. And I will focus today on two of these that we have been looking at with our saliva samples that we've collected from students. And these are epigenomic changes and also changes in the microbiome, or the microbes, bacteria and viruses within the body. And we also know that all of these different types of markers that we can see within these samples that we're looking at, we can look at what these changes are doing to processes in the body. And in particular, for mental health, we are interested in how these interact with things like the immune system, leading to inflammation, and how they interact with neurotransmitters and neuroendocrine systems that we know are important for mental health. So to talk about epigenetic changes, first of all, so if you think about DNA being the code or the language that makes every individual who they are, changes in that DNA or code or language can occur from individual to individual, but there's other ways that that code or language can be read. that will have consequences for biological processes. So if we think about epigenetic modifications as accents or additions to that genetic code that will affect how that code is pronounced or interpreted within the body. And a particular modification that we're interested in is something called DNA methylation, which is a modification or a chemical group that can be added on to the DNA and can change the way that that DNA is read and can determine whether genes are switched on or switched off. And the interesting thing about DNA methylation and why we think it's particularly useful to study in mental health is that unlike DNA itself, DNA methylation and other epigenetic changes are modifiable. And they can change in response to the environment and life experiences and things like traumatic events that we know are very important in mental health. So we've taken our saliva samples and we focused on depression to start with. And we've taken a group of individuals who had depression versus a control group, in our case, people who had never experienced any mental health challenges. And what we see is that we can see an overall change in the pattern of DNA methylation between people who have depression and those who have reported no experience of depression, particularly in the females. And we are seeing this in females primarily because we've looked at more females, so we need to look at more males to see if this also occurs in males. But in the females that we've looked at, we're seeing overall changes in DNA methylation. And when we look at what these changes are doing within biological processes in the body, we see that these changes are primarily linked to changes in inflammation, changes related to genes involved in immune function in the immune system. So that's consistent with some of the other research and reports that are coming out suggesting that the immune system plays a really important role in depression. We've also looked at the bacterial composition, the microbiome within saliva. So you might think it's a bit strange to study bacteria and the microbiome in the context of depression. And this has primarily been studied to date in the gut. And again, you might think, why would you look at something that's happening in the gut and think it has any relation to the brain or mood or any of these things that are important in mental health? But when we think about our language and the way that we describe how we feel, we have intuitively always known that there's a link between our gut and our brain. So we talk about gut feelings and we have butterflies in our stomach when we think about being anxious. So scientists have really started to look at the composition of the gut microbiome and have found that depending on what bacterial species are present in your gut, that can have an influence on your mood. And that can be linked to mood through inflammation or through influences directly on neurotransmission. But we know that this microbial composition of the gut has an impact on mood and depression in particular. And so we wanted to look at, this in saliva, you also have a microbiome. There are bacteria that are involved in regulating activity within the mouth as well. So we wanted to see, what if we look at saliva and look at the oral microbiome and see, do we see any differences in depression within the oral microbiome? And we do. So what we found is that we see overall changes in the oral microbiome associated with depression. And in our early studies, we found 21 particular bacterial species that are different in people with depression and people without. So we need to do more work now, and we have lots more samples now from the SPIT study that we can look further, validate and look at these markers that we've found initially to be important, at least for depression. And just to finish by saying that the goals of these kind of biological studies are to help improve in our understanding of the biological changes, to help us identify new targets for new interventions, and to help us monitor the efficacy of current interventions, Two, as I said, we know that it's very complex and we can't study biological data in isolation. And so we want to integrate it with other environmental and demographic factors. And also to allow us to use individual differences to tailor particular interventions. So I know a lot of these things are quite complex and I haven't been able to go into the details or the methods or anything that we've used today, but happy to answer any questions and to provide any further details for anyone who's interested. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Elaine. That's fantastic. You've explained it actually really, really well. I'm fascinated by your work. It's just incredible. It fits with so much. We're now starting to realize about the biological factors, what happens to us when we experience trauma and stress, and how that links then with mental illness and all the different biological systems that are involved. So that's great. We've very little time for questions, but I would love to hear from the other speakers and what they think of the biological stuff, and is it something that that they can see kind of how this line of research might be useful and valuable in the future. And even just thinking there, Helen, what would your view of this be in the young people that you work with?
Oh, so their views on the biological stuff.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Well, that was part of actually research meeting that I had with Rhonda with the group. Our project, our youth led, I actually manage a group called Members Forum, which is young leaders then do get involved in consultation, and they were really interested in this spit element stuff, and even actually got into a conversation about how young women should be more represented in science. It kind of went, everywhere. I think I totally agree that it's interesting with the how our minds and our gut are connected, and that all areas, it's a ripple effect. So it's not just one thing. So these statistics today have been brilliant, and to unpack them and talk in discussion with young people or to get feedback is I'm always up for. And young people, they don't ever just need asked, their opinion matter. They're there, they want to talk. And I also agree that when I talked about being more worried about passing it on, that's come up in conversation quite a lot too, about, that, I met a young person who, seemed very outgoing and everything, but hadn't left her house, that at all, because it was just that's the fear factor of I don't want to take myself out of the equation, because then the anxiety of bringing it home. So I think research is really important, and we as Youth Action directly, to engage in consultation. So after this, whatever, I'm more than happy to share and get feedback. Go ahead.
Well, what we're interested in doing is bringing together all of the different dimensions. So starting to look at how social and family factors. So Lisa talked about family systems models, and you're applying a life course model. And just thinking about how those kind of family, community and psychological interventions, how they change things, or whether they change things at a biological level, and how we can even measure those changes, and the influence of lifestyle factors then as well, and all of these things. So it's connecting the dots, I think, for me is really, really important. So we can see very clear biological links, but how does that, it's not it's not different from, we're not saying it's one or the other, it could actually be both.
I agree. If it's always moving, you need things, before someone's feeling more at crisis level and after, and then the research in between to prevent it. And the support, the communication and partnership is totally essential, because if collaboration's not there, people are just in their own way hubs doing stuff. So it's kind of, there's so much expertise and willingness that is really most powerful whenever it's collaborated together. Yeah.
What about mental? Have you any views on the biological research? Is that something that young people are interested in themselves? Is that a line you want to go down, or are you more interested in how social factors, or is it a combination of both? Do we have any of our pure mental colleagues?
Yeah, that's really more for our researcher to talk about than us, but well, we'll be working with, he's also called Matthew, we'll be working with him, Jay and I, on a mental health report to the Department of Education And as part of that, he has a lot of ideas about how we should be focusing on other methods other than drugs and medications to treat mental illness. So he talks a lot about intervention methods, about like yoga, about that sort of thing that has helped mental health. But I find that presentation really interesting, and I'll certainly be passing it on to Matthew if that's all right with the presenter with.
I mean, the idea of that probiotics, for example.
But I find that really interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that even studying the biology, how it changes in response to even non-medication interventions, I think can give us a lot of information, because, you know, it's even things like, how does our stress response, how is it changed in response to particular interventions? And if we can see that change biologically, I think it almost gives us that kind of, you know, additional reason to, additional evidence that it's working, and it gives us that kind of confidence. So I think it's not just about new drugs, it's about understanding how the body is working and how these interventions are helping the body to respond appropriately where it maybe isn't responding appropriately currently.
I think it reminds us of the fact that at the end of the day, we're physical, we're human, we're animals. We're dealing with this animal brain. So when we develop mental health problems, it's not necessarily our fault. It's a physical thing. It's very real. It's not in our heads, as in it's not something we imagine. This is a real thing, and we can measure shifts and changes physically. So it should take away some of the stigma, I think, from having a mental illness and asking for treatment for that mental illness, because we can see the physical benefit. You know, we can see the physical changes. We can measure this stuff. So I think that's another positive thing that comes out of looking at the biological side of things as well, and including those as ways of checking where we are and whether we're at risk and how well we're doing in terms of treatments and interventions, as you say.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think as well, like there's an increased understanding now that physical health and mental health are not two separate things, and that for some people, increases in inflammation might lead to cardiovascular disease or diabetes, and for other people, it might lead to depression. And just taking away that difference between mental health specifically and showing that it's a result of a biological process, just like any other physical illness, I think would really help with that.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Even though the causal factors might be things that happen to us, it could be experiences and exposures we've had, it affects us physically, you know, and I think it's important to acknowledge and recognize that. Okay, we're a wee bit over 2 o'clock, so unfortunately we can't continue the conversation, but what we would like to do is, if we have your permission, to include your email addresses just in the follow-up information we send to the delegates here, so that they can send on any questions or comments they might have, if that's okay. So thank you so much. We will be back after Christmas with more webinars. So please let us know what you would like to see. You can tweet us, you can email. Rhonda there is looking after things and has been brilliant. And thank you again, Rhonda, for organising this. So if you just let Rhonda know what you'd like to see or your nominations for speakers. And thank you, and have a lovely, restful, safe, festive season. And we'll be back in the new year, and there'll be vaccines and things will be looking a lot brighter. So thank you. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye.